The Hazelnut Child. There was once upon a time a couple who had no children, and they prayed heaven every day to send them a child, though it were no bigger than a hazelnut. At last heaven heard their prayer and sent them a child exactly the size of a hazelnut, and it never grew an inch. The parents were very devoted to the little creature, and nursed and tended it carefully. Their tiny son, too, was as clever as he could be, and so sharp and sensible that all the neighbors marveled over the wise things he said and did. When the hazelnut child was 15 years old, and was sitting one day in an eggshell on the table beside his mother, she turned to him and said, "You are now 15 years old, and nothing can be done with you. What do you intend to be?" "A messenger," answered the hazelnut child. Then his mother burst out laughing and said, "What an idea! You a messenger? Why, your little feet would take an hour to go the distance an ordinary person could do in a minute." But the hazelnut child replied, "Nevertheless, I mean to be a messenger. Just send me a message, and you'll see that I shall be back in next to no time." So his mother said, "Very well. Go to your aunt in the neighboring village and fetch me a comb." The hazelnut child jumped quickly out of the eggshell and ran out into the street. Here he found a man on horseback who was just setting out for the neighboring village. He crept up the horse's leg, sat down under the saddle, and then began to pinch the horse and to prick it with a pin. The horse plunged and reared and then set off at a hard gallop, which it continued in spite of its rider's efforts to stop it. When they reached the village, the hazelnut child left off pricking the horse, and the poor tired creature pursued its way at a snail's pace. The hazelnut child took advantage of this and crept down the horse's leg. Then he ran to his aunt and asked her for a comb. On the way home he met another rider and did the return journey in exactly the same way. When he handed his mother the comb that his aunt had given him, she was much amazed and asked him, "But how did you manage to get back so quickly?" "Ah, mother," he replied, "you see, I was quite right when I said I knew a messenger was the profession for me. His father, too, possessed a horse which he often used to take out into the fields to graze. One day he took the hazelnut child with him. At midday the father turned to his small son and said, 'Stay here and look after the horse. I must go home and give your mother a message, but I shall be back soon.' When his father had gone, a robber passed by and saw the horse grazing without anyone watching it, for of course he could not see the hazelnut child hidden in the grass. So he mounted the horse and rode away. But the hazelnut child, who was the most active little creature, climbed up the horse's tail and began to bite it on the back, enraging the creature to such an extent that it paid no attention to the direction the robber tried to make it go in, but galloped straight home. The father was much astonished when he saw a stranger riding his horse, but the hazelnut child climbed down quickly and told him all that had happened, and his father had the robber arrested at once and put into prison. One autumn, when the hazelnut child was 20 years old, he said to his parents, "Farewell, my dear father and mother. I am going to set out into the world, and as soon as I have become rich, I will return home to you." The parents laughed at the little man's words, but did not believe him for a moment. In the evening, the hazelnut child crept onto the roof, where some storks had built their nest. The storks were fast asleep, and he climbed onto the back of the father stork and bound a silk cord round the joint of one of its wings. Then he crept among its soft downy feathers and fell asleep. The next morning, the storks flew towards the south, for winter was approaching. The hazelnut child flew through the air on the stork's back, and when he wanted to rest, he bound his silk cord onto the joint of the bird's other wing, so that it could not fly any farther. In this way, he reached the country of the black people, where the storks took up their abode close to the capital. When the people saw the hazelnut child, they were much astonished and took him with the stork to the king of the country. The king was delighted with the little creature and kept him always beside him, and he soon grew so fond of the little man that he gave him a diamond 4 times as big as himself. The hazelnut child fastened the diamond firmly under the stork's neck with a ribbon, and when he saw that the other storks were getting ready for their northern flight, he untied the silk cord from his stork's wings, and away they went, getting nearer home every minute. At length the hazelnut child came to his native village. Then he undid the ribbon from the stork's neck, and the diamond fell to the ground. He covered it first with sand and stones, and then ran to get his parents, so that they might carry the treasure home, for he himself was not able to lift the great diamond. So the hazelnut child and his parents lived in happiness and prosperity after this, till they died. The Invisible Prince. Once upon a time there lived a fairy who had power over the earth, the sea, fire, and the air, and this fairy had 4 sons. The eldest, who was quick and lively with a vivid imagination, she made Lord of Fire, which was in her opinion the noblest of all the elements. To the second son, whose wisdom and prudence made amends for his being rather dull, she gave the government of the earth. The third was wild and savage, and of monstrous stature, and the fairy, his mother, who was ashamed of his defects, hoped to hide them by creating him King of the Seas. The youngest, who was the slave of his passions and of a very uncertain temper, became Prince of the Air. Being the youngest, he was naturally his mother's favorite, but this did not blind her to his weaknesses, and she foresaw that some day he would suffer much pain through falling in love. So she thought the best thing she could do was to bring him up with a horror of women, and, to her great delight, she saw this dislike only increased as he grew older. From his earliest childhood he heard nothing but stories of princes who had fallen into all sorts of troubles through love, and she drew such terrible pictures of poor little Cupid that the young man had no difficulty in believing that he was the root of all evil. All the time that this wise mother could spare from filling her son with hatred for all womankind, she passed in giving him a love of the pleasures of the chase, which henceforth became his chief joy. For his amusement she had made a new forest, planted with the most splendid trees, and turned loose in it every animal that could be found in any of the 4 quarters of the globe. In the midst of this forest she built a palace, which had not its equal for beauty in the whole world, and then she considered that she had done enough to make any prince happy. Now it is all very well to abuse the god of love, but a man cannot struggle against his fate. In his secret heart the prince got tired of his mother's constant talk on this subject, and when one day she quitted the palace to attend to some business, begging him never to go beyond the grounds, he at once jumped at the chance of disobeying her. Left to himself, the prince soon forgot the wise counsels of his mother, and feeling very much bored with his own company, he ordered some of the spirits of the air to carry him to the court of a neighboring sovereign. This kingdom was situated in the island of Roses, where the climate is so delicious that the grass is always green and the flowers always sweet. The waves, instead of beating on the rocks, seemed to die gently on the shore. Clusters of golden bushes covered the land, and the vines were bent low with grapes. The king of this island had a daughter named Rosalie, who was more lovely than any girl in the whole world. No sooner had the eyes of the Prince of the Air rested on her than he forgot all the terrible woes which had been prophesied to him ever since he was born. For in one single moment the plans of years are often upset. He instantly began to think how best to make himself happy. and the shortest way that occurred to him was to have Rosalie carried off by his attendant spirits. It is easy to imagine the feelings of the king when he found that his daughter had vanished. He wept her loss night and day, and his only comfort was to talk over it with a young and unknown prince who had just arrived at the court. Alas! He did not know what a deep interest the stranger had in Rosalie, for he too had seen her and had fallen a victim to her charms. One day the king, more sorrowful than usual, was walking sadly along the seashore, when after a long silence the unknown prince, who was his only companion, suddenly spoke. "There is no evil without a remedy," he said to the unhappy father, "and if you will promise me your daughter in marriage, I will undertake to bring her back to you." "You are trying to soothe me by vain promises," answered the king. "Did I not see her caught up into the air? In spite of cries which would have softened the heart of anyone but the barbarian who has robbed me of her? The unfortunate girl is pining away in some unknown land, where perhaps no foot of man has ever trod, and I shall see her no more. But go, generous stranger, bring back Rosalie if you can, and live happy with her ever after in this country, of which I now declare you heir." Although the stranger's name and rank were unknown to Rosalie's father, he was really the son of the king of the Golden Isle, which had for capital a city that extended from one sea to another. The walls, washed by the quiet waters, were covered with gold, which made one think of the yellow sands. Above them was a rampart of orange and lemon trees, and all the streets were paved with gold. The king of this beautiful island had one son, for whom a life of adventure had been foretold at his birth. This so frightened his father and mother that in order to comfort them, a fairy, who happened to be present at the time, produced a little pebble, which she told them to keep for the prince till he grew up, as by putting it in his mouth he would become invisible, as long as he did not try to speak, for if he did, the stone would lose all its virtue. In this way, the good fairy hoped that the prince would be protected against all dangers. No sooner did the prince begin to grow out of boyhood than he longed to see if the other countries of the world were as splendid as the one in which he lived. So, under pretence of visiting some small islands that belonged to his father, he set out. But a frightful storm drove his ship onto unknown shores, where most of his followers were put to death by the savages, and the prince himself only managed to escape by making use of his magic pebble. By this means he passed through the midst of them unseen, and wandered on till he reached the coast, where he re-embarked on board his ship. The first land he sighted was the Island of Roses, and he went at once to the court of the king, Rosalie's father. The moment his eyes beheld the princess, he fell in love with her like everyone else. He had already spent several months in this condition when the prince of the air whirled her away, to the grief and despair of every man on the island. But sad though everybody was, the prince of the Golden Isle was perfectly inconsolable, and he passed both days and nights in bemoaning his loss. "Alas!" he cried, "shall I never see my lovely princess again? Who knows where she may be, and what fairy may have her in his keeping? I am only a man, but I am strong in my love, and I will seek the whole world through till I find her." So saying, he left the court and made ready for his journey. He travelled many weary days without hearing a single word of the lost princess, till one morning, as he was walking through a thick forest, he suddenly perceived a magnificent palace standing at the end of a pine avenue, and his heart bounded to think that he might be gazing on Rosalie's prison. He hastened his steps, and quickly arrived at the gate of the palace, which was formed of a single agate. The gate swung open to let him through, and he next passed successively 3 courts, surrounded by deep ditches filled with running water, with birds of brilliant plumage flying about the banks. Everything around was rare and beautiful. But the prince scarcely raised his eyes to all these wonders. He thought only of the princess and where he should find her. But in vain he opened every door and searched in every corner. He neither saw Rosalie nor anyone else. At last there was no place left for him to search but a little wood, which contained in the centre a sort of hall built entirely of orange trees, with 4 small rooms opening out of the corners. 3 of these were empty except for statues and wonderful things, but in the 4th the invisible prince caught sight of Rosalie. His joy at beholding her again was, however, somewhat lessened by seeing that the Prince of the Air was kneeling at her feet and pleading his own cause. But it was in vain that he implored her to listen. She only shook her head. "No," was all she would say. "You snatched me from my father whom I loved, and all the splendor in the world can never console me. Go, I can never feel anything towards you but hate and contempt." With these words she turned away and entered her own apartments. Unknown to herself, the invisible prince had followed her. But fearing to be discovered by the princess in the presence of others, he made up his mind to wait quietly till dark, and employed the long hours in writing a poem to the princess, which he laid on the bed beside her. This done, he thought of nothing but how best to deliver Rosalie, and he resolved to take advantage of a visit which the Prince of the Air paid every year to his mother and brothers in order to strike the blow. One day, Rosalie was sitting alone in her room thinking of her troubles when she suddenly saw a pen get up from off the desk and begin to write all by itself on a sheet of white paper. As she did not know that it was guided by an invisible hand, she was very much astonished, and the moment that the pen had ceased to move, she instantly went over to the table where she found some lovely verses, telling her that another shared her distresses, whatever they might be, and loved her with all his heart, and that he would never rest until he had delivered her from the hands of the man she hated. Thus encouraged, she told him all her story, and of the arrival of a young stranger in her father's palace, whose looks had so charmed her that since that day she had thought of no one else. At these words the prince could contain himself no longer. He took the pebble from his mouth and flung himself at Rosalie's feet. When they had got over the first rapture of meeting, they began to make plans to escape from the power of the Prince of the Air. But this did not prove easy, for the magic stone would only serve for one person at a time, and in order to save Rosalie, the Prince of the Golden Isle would have to expose himself to the fury of his enemy. But Rosalie would not hear of this. "No, Prince," she said, "since you are here, this island no longer feels a prison. Besides, you are under the protection of a fairy who always visits your father's court at this season. Go instantly and seek her, and when she is found, implore the gift of another stone with similar powers. Once you have that, there will be no further difficulty in the way of escape." The Prince of the Air returned a few days later from his mother's palace, but the invisible prince had already set out. He had, however, entirely forgotten the road by which he had come, and lost himself for so long in the forest that when at last he reached home, the fairy had already left, and, in spite of all his grief, there was nothing for it but to wait till the fairy's next visit, and allow Rosalie to suffer 3 months longer. This thought drove him to despair, and he had almost made up his mind to return to the place of her captivity, when one day, as he was strolling along an alley in the woods, he saw a huge oak open its trunk, and out of it step 2 princes in earnest conversation. As our hero had the magic stone in his mouth, they imagined themselves alone and did not lower their voices. "What," said one, "are you always going to allow yourself to be tormented by a passion which can never end happily? And in your whole kingdom can you find nothing else to satisfy you?" "What is the use," replied the other, "of being Prince of the Gnomes? and having a mother who is queen over all the 4 elements, if I cannot win the love of the Princess Argentine. From the moment that I first saw her, sitting in the forest surrounded by flowers, I have never ceased to think of her night and day, and, although I love her, I am quite convinced that she will never care for me. You know that I have in my palace the cabinets of the years. In the first, great mirrors reflect the past. In the second, we contemplate the present. In the third, the future can be read. It was here that I fled after I had gazed on the Princess Argentine, but instead of love, I only saw scorn and contempt. Think how great must be my devotion, when, in spite of my fate, I still love on. No. The Prince of the Golden Isle was enchanted with this conversation, for the Princess Argentine was his sister, and he hoped, by means of her influence over the Prince of the Gnomes, to obtain from his brother the release of Rosalie. So he joyfully returned to his father's palace, where he found his friend the fairy, who at once presented him with a magic pebble like his own. As may be imagined, he lost no time in setting out to deliver Rosalie, and travelled so fast that he soon arrived at the forest, in the midst of which she lay a captive. But though he found the palace, he did not find Rosalie. He hunted high and low, but there was no sign of her, and his despair was so great that he was ready 1,000 times over to take his own life. At last he remembered the conversation of the 2 princes about the cabinets of the years, and that if he could manage to reach the oak tree, he would be certain to discover what had become of Rosalie. Happily, he soon found out the secret of the passage and entered the cabinet of the present, where he saw reflected in the mirrors the unfortunate Rosalie sitting on the floor weeping bitterly, and surrounded with genii who never left her night or day. This sight only increased the misery of the prince, for he did not know where the castle was, nor how to set about finding it. However, he resolved to seek the whole world through till he came to the right place. He began by setting sail in a favourable wind, but his bad luck followed him even on the sea. He had scarcely lost sight of the land when a violent storm arose, and after several hours of beating about, the vessel was driven on to some rocks, on which it dashed itself to bits. The prince was fortunate enough to be able to lay hold of a floating spar, and contrived to keep himself afloat, and after a long struggle with the winds and waves, he was cast upon a strange island. But what was his surprise, on reaching the shore, to hear sounds of the most heart-rending distress, mingled with the sweetest songs which had ever charmed him. His curiosity was instantly roused, and he advanced cautiously till he saw 2 huge dragons guarding the gate of a wood. They were terrible indeed to look upon. Their bodies were covered with glittering scales, their curly tails extended far over the land, flames darted from their mouths and noses, and their eyes would have made the bravest shudder. But as the prince was invisible and they did not see him, he slipped past them into the wood. He found himself at once in a labyrinth, and wandered about for a long time without meeting anyone. In fact, the only sight he saw was a circle of human hands sticking out of the ground above the wrist, each with a bracelet of gold on which a name was written. The farther he advanced in the labyrinth, the more curious he became, till he was stopped by 2 corpses lying in the midst of a cypress alley, each with a scarlet cord round his neck and a bracelet on his arm, on which were engraved their own names, and those of 2 princesses. The invisible prince recognized these dead men as kings of 2 large islands near his own home, but the names of the princesses were unknown to him. He grieved for their unhappy fate, and at once proceeded to bury them. But no sooner had he laid them in their graves than their hands started up through the earth and remained sticking up like those of their fellows. The prince went on his way, thinking about this strange adventure, when suddenly at the turn of the walk he perceived a tall man whose face was the picture of misery, holding in his hands a silken cord of the exact colour of those round the necks of the dead men. A few steps further, this man came up with another. As miserable to the full as he himself, they silently embraced, and then, without a word, passed the cords round their throats, and fell dead side by side. In vain the prince rushed to their assistance, and strove to undo the cord. He could not loosen it, so he buried them like the others, and continued his path. He felt, however, that great prudence was necessary, or he himself might become the victim of some enchantment, and he was thankful to slip past the dragons and enter a beautiful park with clear streams and sweet flowers and a crowd of men and maidens. But he could not forget the terrible things he had seen, and hoped eagerly for a clue to the mystery. Noticing two young people talking together, he drew near, thinking that he might get some explanation of what puzzled him, and so he did. "You swear," said the prince, "that you will love me till you die, but I fear your faithless heart, and I feel that I shall soon have to seek the fairy Despair, ruler of half this island. She carries off the lovers who have been cast away by their mistresses and wish to have done with life. She places them in a labyrinth where they are condemned to walk forever, with a bracelet on their arms and a cord round their necks, unless they meet another as miserable as themselves. Then the cord is pulled, and they lie where they fall, till they are buried by the first passer-by. Terrible as this death would be," added the prince, "it would be sweeter than life if I had lost your love." The sight of all these happy lovers only made the prince grieve the more, and he wandered along the seashore spending his days. But one day he was sitting on a rock bewailing his fate and the impossibility of leaving the island, when all in a moment the sea appeared to raise itself nearly to the skies, and the caves echoed with hideous screams. As he looked, a woman rose from the depths of the sea, flying madly before a furious giant. The cries she uttered softened the heart of the prince. He took the stone from his mouth, and drawing his sword he rushed after the giant, so as to give the lady time to escape. But hardly had he come within reach of the enemy than the giant touched him with a ring that he held in his hand, and the prince remained immovable where he stood. The giant then hastily rejoined his prey, and, seizing her in his arms, he plunged her into the sea. Then he sent some tritons to bind chains about the Prince of the Golden Isle, and he too felt himself borne to the depths of the ocean, and without the hope of ever again seeing the princess. Now the giant whom the invisible had so rashly attacked was the Lord of the Sea, and the third son of the Queen of the Elements, and he had touched the youth with a magic ring which enabled a mortal to live under water. So the Prince of the Golden Isle found, when bound in chains by the Tritons, he was carried through the homes of strange monsters and past immense seaweed forests, till he reached a vast sandy space surrounded by huge rocks. On the tallest of the rocks sat the giant as on a throne. "Rash mortal," said he, when the prince was dragged before him, "you have deserved death, but you shall live only to suffer more cruelly. Go, and add to the number of those whom it is my pleasure to torture." At these words the unhappy prince found himself tied to a rock, but he was not alone in his misfortunes, for all round him were chained princes and princesses whom the giant had led captive. Indeed, it was his chief delight to create a storm, in order to add to the list of his prisoners. As his hands were fastened, it was impossible for the Prince of the Golden Isle to make use of his magic stone, and he passed his nights and days dreaming of Rosalie. But at last the time came when the giant took it into his head to amuse himself by arranging fights between some of his captives. Lots were drawn, and one fell upon our prince, whose chains were immediately loosened. The moment he was set free, he snatched up his stone and became invisible. The astonishment of the giant at the sudden disappearance of the prince may well be imagined. He ordered all the passages to be watched, but it was too late, for the prince had already glided between two rocks. He wandered for a long while through the forests, where he met nothing but fearful monsters. He climbed rock after rock, steered his way from tree to tree, till at length he arrived at the edge of the sea, at the foot of a mountain that he remembered to have seen in the cabinet of the present, where Rosalie was held captive. Filled with joy, he made his way to the top of the mountain which pierced the clouds, and there he found a palace. He entered, and in the middle of a long gallery he discovered a crystal room, in the midst of which sat Rosalie, guarded night and day by genii. There was no door anywhere, nor any window. At this sight the prince became more puzzled than ever, for he did not know how he was to warn Rosalie of his return. Yet it broke his heart to see her weeping from dawn till dark. One day, as Rosalie was walking up and down her room, she was surprised to see that the crystal which served for a wall had grown cloudy, as if someone had breathed on it, and, what was more, wherever she moved, the brightness of the crystal always became clouded. This was enough to cause the princess to suspect that her lover had returned. In order to set the Prince of the Air's mind at rest, she began by being very gracious to him, so that when she begged that her captivity might be a little lightened, she should not be refused. At first, the only favor she asked was to be allowed to walk for 1 hour every day up and down the long gallery. This was granted, and the invisible prince speedily took the opportunity of handing her the stone, which she at once slipped into her mouth. No words can paint the fury of her captor at her disappearance. He ordered the spirits of the air to fly through all space, and to bring back Rosalie wherever she might be. They instantly flew off to obey his commands, and spread themselves over the whole earth. Meantime, Rosalie and the invisible prince had reached, hand in hand, a door of the gallery which led through a terrace into the gardens. In silence they glided along, and thought themselves already safe, when a furious monster dashed itself by accident against Rosalie and the invisible prince, and in her fright she let go his hand. No one can speak as long as he is invisible, and besides, they knew that the spirits were all around them, and at the slightest sound they would be recognized. So all they could do was to feel about in the hope that their hands might once more meet. But, alas, the joy of liberty lasted but a short time. The princess, having wandered in vain up and down the forest, stopped at last on the edge of a fountain. As she walked, she wrote on the trees, "If ever the prince, my lover, comes this way, let him know that it is here I dwell, and that I sit daily on the edge of this fountain, mingling my tears with its waters." These words were read by one of the genii, who repeated them to his master. The Prince of the Air, in his turn making himself invisible, was led to the fountain, and waited for Rosalie. When she drew near, he held out his hand, which she grasped eagerly, taking it for that of her lover, and, seizing his opportunity, the prince passed a cord round her arms, and throwing off his invisibility, cried to his spirits to drag her into the lowest pit. It was at this moment that the invisible prince appeared, and at the sight of the prince of the genii mounting into the air, holding a silken cord, he guessed instantly that he was carrying off Rosalie. He felt so overwhelmed by despair that he thought for an instant of putting an end to his life. "Can I survive my misfortunes?" he cried. "I fancied I had come to an end of my troubles, and now they are worse than ever. What will become of me? Never can I discover the place where this monster will hide Rosalie." The unhappy youth had determined to let himself die, and indeed his sorrow alone was enough to kill him, when the thought that by means of the cabinets of the years he might find out where the princess was imprisoned gave him a little ray of comfort. So he continued to walk on through the forest, and after some hours he arrived at the gate of a temple, guarded by 2 huge lions. Being invisible, he was able to enter unharmed. In the middle of the temple was an altar, on which lay a book, and behind the altar hung a great curtain. The prince approached the altar and opened the book, which contained the names of all the lovers in the world, and in it he read that Rosalie had been carried off by the prince of the air to an abyss which had no entrance except the one that lay by way of the fountain of gold. Now, as the prince had not the smallest idea where this fountain was to be found, it might be thought that he was not much nearer Rosalie than before. This was not, however, the view taken by the prince. "Though every step that I take may perhaps lead me further from her," he said to himself, "I am still thankful to know that she is alive somewhere." On leaving the temple, the invisible prince saw 6 paths lying before him, each of which led through the wood. He was hesitating which to choose, when he suddenly beheld 2 people coming towards him, down the track which lay most to his right. They turned out to be the Prince Gnome and his friend, and the sudden desire to get some news of his sister, Princess Argentine, caused the invisible prince to follow them and to listen to their conversation. "Do you think," the Prince Gnome was saying, "do you think that I would not break my chains if I could? I know that the Princess Argentine will never love me, yet each day I feel her dearer still. And as if this were not enough, I have the horror of feeling that she probably loves another. So I have resolved to put myself out of my pain by means of the golden fountain. A single drop of its water falling on the sand around will trace the name of my rival in her heart. I dread the test, and yet this very dread convinces me of my misfortune." It may be imagined that after listening to these words, the invisible prince followed Prince Gnome like his shadow, and after walking some time, they arrived at the golden fountain. The unhappy lover stooped down with a sigh, and dipping his finger in the water let fall a drop on the sand. It instantly wrote the name of Prince Flame, his brother. The shock of this discovery was so real that Prince Gnome sank fainting into the arms of his friend. Meanwhile, the invisible prince was turning over in his mind how he could best deliver Rosalie, as, since he had been touched by the giant's ring, he had the power to live in the water as well as on land. He at once dived into the fountain. He perceived in one corner a door leading into the mountain, and at the foot of the mountain was a high rock on which was fixed an iron ring with a cord attached. The prince promptly guessed that the cord was used to chain the princess, and drew his sword and cut it. In a moment he felt the princess's hand in his, for she had always kept her magic pebble in her mouth, in spite of the prayers and entreaties of the Prince of the Air to make herself visible. So hand in hand the invisible prince and Rosalie crossed the mountain. But as the princess had no power of living under water, she could not pass the golden fountain. Speechless and invisible, they clung together on the brink, trembling at the frightful tempest the Prince of the Air had raised in his fury. The storm had already lasted many days when tremendous heat began to make itself felt. The lightning flashed, the thunder rattled, firebolts fell from heaven, burning up the forests and even the fields of corn. In one instant the very streams were dried up, and the prince, seizing his opportunity, carried the princess over the golden fountain. It took them a long time still to reach the Golden Isle, but at last they got there, and we may be quite sure they never wanted to leave it any more. The Iron Stove. Once upon a time, when wishes came true, there was a king's son who was enchanted by an old witch, so that he was obliged to sit in a large iron stove in a wood. There he lived for many years, and no one could free him. At last, a king's daughter came into the wood. She had lost her way and could not find her father's kingdom again. She had been wandering round and round for 9 days, and she came at last to the iron case. A voice came from within and asked her, "Where do you come from, and where do you want to go?" She answered, "I have lost my way to my father's kingdom, and I shall never get home again." Then the voice from the iron stove said, "I will help you to find your home again, and that in a very short time, if you will promise to do what I ask you. I am a greater prince than you are a princess, and I will marry you." Then she grew frightened and thought, "What can a young lassie do with an iron stove?" But as she wanted very much to go home to her father, she promised to do what he wished. He said, "You must come again, and bring a knife with you to scrape a hole in the iron." Then he gave her someone for a guide, who walked near her and said nothing, but he brought her in 2 hours to her house. There was great joy in the castle when the princess came back, and the old king fell on her neck and kissed her. But she was very much troubled and said, "Dear father, listen to what has befallen me. I should never have come home again out of the great wild wood if I had not come to an iron stove, to whom I have had to promise that I will go back to free him and marry him." The old king was so frightened that he nearly fainted, for she was his only daughter. So they consulted together and determined that the miller's daughter, who was very beautiful, should take her place. They took her there, gave her a knife, and said she must scrape at the iron stove. She scraped for 24 hours, but did not make the least impression. When the day broke, a voice called from the iron stove, "It seems to me that it is day outside." Then she answered, "It seems so to me. I think I hear my father's mill rattling." "So, you are a miller's daughter? Then go away at once, and tell the king's daughter to come." Then she went away, and told the old king that the thing inside the iron stove would not have her, but wanted the princess. The old king was frightened, and his daughter wept. But they had a swineherd's daughter who was even more beautiful than the miller's daughter, and they gave her a piece of gold to go to the iron stove instead of the princess. Then she was taken out and had to scrape for 24 hours, but she could make no impression. As soon as the day broke, the voice from the stove called out, "It seems to be daylight outside." Then she answered, "It seems so to me too. I think I hear my father blowing his horn." "So, you are a swineherd's daughter. Go away at once, and let the king's daughter come, and say to her that what I foretell shall come to pass. And if she does not come, everything in the kingdom shall fall into ruin, and not one stone shall be left upon another." When the princess heard this, she began to cry, but it was no good. She had to keep her word. She took leave of her father, put a knife in her belt, and went to the iron stove in the wood. As soon as she reached it, she began to scrape, and the iron gave way, and before 2 hours had passed, she had made a little hole. Then she peeped in and saw such a beautiful youth, all shining with gold and precious stones, that she fell in love with him on the spot. So she scraped away harder than ever, and made the hole so large that he could get out. Then he said, "You are mine, and I am thine. You are my bride, and have set me free." He wanted to take her with him to his kingdom, but she begged him just to let her go once more to her father. And the prince let her go, but told her not to say more than 3 words to her father, then to come back again. So she went home, but alas, she said more than 3 words, and immediately the iron stove vanished and went away over a mountain of glass and sharp swords. But the prince was free, and was no longer shut up in it. Then she said goodbye to her father, and took a little money with her, and went again into the great wood to look for the iron stove. But she could not find it. She sought it for 9 days, and then her hunger became so great that she did not know how she could live any longer. And when it was evening, she climbed a little tree and wished that the night would not come, because she was afraid of the wild beasts. When midnight came, she saw afar off a little light and thought, "Ah, if only I could reach that!" Then she got down from the tree and went towards the light. She came to a little old house with a great deal of grass growing round, and stood in front of a little heap of wood. She thought, "Alas, what am I coming to?" and peeped through the window, but she saw nothing inside except big and little toads, and a table beautifully spread with roast meats and wine, and all the dishes and drinking cups were of silver. Then she took heart and knocked. Then a fat toad called out, "Little green toad with leg like crook, open wide the door, and look." Who it was the latch that shook, and a little toad came forward and let her in. When she entered, they all bid her welcome and made her sit down. They asked her how she came there and what she wanted. Then she told everything that had happened to her, and how, because she had exceeded her permission only to speak 3 words, the stove had disappeared with the prince, and how she had searched a very long time, and must wander over mountain and valley till she found him. Then the old toad said, "Little green toad whose leg doth twist, go to the corner of which you wist, and bring to me the large old kist." And the little toad went and brought out a great chest. Then they gave her food and drink, and led her to a beautifully made bed of silk and samite, on which she lay down and slept soundly. When the day dawned, she arose, and the old toad gave her 3 things out of the huge chest to take with her. She would have need of them, for she had to cross a high glass mountain, 3 cutting swords, and a great lake. When she had passed these, she would find her lover again. So she was given 3 large needles, a plough wheel, and 3 nuts, which she was to take great care of. She set out with these things, and when she came to the glass mountain, which was so slippery, she stuck the 3 needles behind her feet, and then in front, and so got over it, and when she was on the other side, put them carefully away. Then she reached the 3 cutting swords, and got on her plough wheel and rolled over them. At last she came to a great lake, and, when she had crossed that, arrived at a beautiful castle. She went in and gave herself out as a servant, a poor maid who would gladly be engaged. But she knew that the prince whom she had freed from the iron stove in the great wood was in the castle. So she was taken on as a kitchen maid for very small wages. Now the prince was about to marry another princess, for he thought she was dead long ago. In the evening, when she had washed up and was ready, she felt in her pocket and found the 3 nuts which the old toad had given her. She cracked one, and was going to eat the kernel, when, behold, there was a beautiful royal dress inside it. When the bride heard of this, she came and begged for the dress, and wanted to buy it, saying that it was not a dress for a serving maid. Then she said she would not sell it unless she was granted 1 favour, namely, to sleep by the prince's door. The bride granted her this, because the dress was so beautiful, and she had so few like it. When it was evening, she said to her bridegroom, "That stupid maid wants to sleep by your door." "If you are contented, I am," he said. But she gave him a glass of wine in which she had poured a sleeping draught. Then they both went to his room, but he slept so soundly that she could not wake him. The maid wept all night long, and said, "I freed you in the wild wood out of the iron stove. I have sought you, and have crossed a glassy mountain, 3 sharp swords, and a great lake before I found you. And will you not hear me now?" The servants outside heard how she cried the whole night, and they told their master in the morning. When she had washed up the next evening, she bit the second nut, and there was a still more beautiful dress inside. When the bride saw it, she wanted to buy it also. But the maid did not want money, and asked that she should sleep again by the prince's door. The bride, however, gave him a sleeping draught, and he slept so soundly that he heard nothing. But the kitchen maid wept the whole night long, and said, "I have freed you in a wood, and from an iron stove I sought you, and have crossed a glassy mountain, 3 sharp swords, and a great lake to find you, and now you will not hear me." The servants outside heard how she cried the whole night, and in the morning they told their master. And when she had washed up on the 3rd night, she bit the 3rd nut, and there was a still more beautiful dress inside that was made of pure gold. When the bride saw it, she wanted to have it, but the maid would only give it her on condition that she should sleep for the 3rd time by the prince's door. But the prince took care not to drink the sleeping draught. When she began to weep and to say, "Dearest sweetheart, I freed you in the horrible wild wood, and from an iron stove," he jumped up and said, "You are right. You are mine, and I am thine." Though it was still night, he got into a carriage with her, and they took the false bride's clothes away so that she could not follow them. When they came to the great lake, they rowed across, and when they reached the 3 sharp swords, they sat on the plough wheel, and on the glassy mountain they stuck the 3 needles in. So they arrived at last at the little old house, but when they stepped inside, it turned into a large castle. The toads were all freed, and were beautiful king's children, running about for joy. There they were married, and they remained in the castle, which was much larger than that of the princess's father's. But because the old man did not like being left alone, they went and fetched him. So they had 2 kingdoms and lived in great wealth. A mouse has run. My story's done. The Little Green Frog. In a part of the world whose name I forget, lived once upon a time 2 kings called Peridor and Diamantino. They were cousins as well as neighbors, and both were under the protection of the fairies, though it is only fair to say that the fairies did not love them half so well as their wives did. Now it often happens that as princes can generally manage to get their own way, it is harder for them to be good than it is for common people. So it was with Peridor and Diamantino. But of the 2, the fairies declared that Diamantino was much the worst. Indeed, he behaved so badly to his wife Atlantino that the fairies would not allow him to live any longer, and he died, leaving behind him a little daughter. As she was an only child, of course this little girl was the heiress of the kingdom, but being still only a baby, her mother, the widow of Diamantino, was proclaimed regent. The Queen Dowager was wise and good, and tried her best to make her people happy. The only thing she had to vex her was the absence of her daughter, for the fairies, for reasons of their own, determined to bring up the little Princess Serpentine among themselves. As to the other king, he was really fond of his wife, Queen Constance, but he often grieved her by his thoughtless ways, and in order to punish him for his carelessness, the fairies caused her to die quite suddenly. When she was gone, the king felt how much he had loved her, and his grief was so great, though he never neglected his duties, that his subjects called him Peridor, the Sorrowful. It seems hardly possible that any man should live like Peridor for 15 years, plunged in such depth of grief, and most likely he would have died too if it had not been for the fairies. The one comfort the poor king had was his son, Prince Sophia, who was only 3 years old at the time of his mother's death, and great care was given to his education. By the time he was 15, Sophia had learnt everything that a prince should know, and he was, besides, charming and agreeable. It was about this time that the fairies suddenly took fright lest his love for his father should interfere with the plans they had made for the young prince. So, to prevent this, they placed in a pretty little room, of which Saphir was very fond, a little mirror in a black frame, such as were often brought from Venice. The prince did not notice for some days that there was anything new in the room, but at last he perceived it and went up to look at it more closely. What was his surprise to see reflected in the mirror, not his own face, but that of a young girl as lovely as the morning. And, better still, every movement of the girl, just growing out of childhood, was also reflected in the wonderful glass. As might have been expected, the young prince lost his heart completely to the beautiful image, and it was impossible to get him out of the room, so busy was he in watching the lovely unknown. Certainly it was very delightful to be able to see her whom he loved at any moment he chose, but his spirits sometimes sank when he wondered what was to be the end of this adventure. The magic mirror had been for about a year in the prince's possession, when one day a new subject of disquiet seized upon him. As usual, he was engaged in looking at the girl, when suddenly he thought he saw a second mirror reflected in the first, exactly like his own, and with the same power. And in this he was perfectly right. The young girl had only possessed it for a short time, and neglected all her duties for the sake of the mirror. Now it was not difficult for Saphir to guess the reason of the change in her, nor why the new mirror was consulted so often. But try as he would, he could never see the face of the person who was reflected in it, for the young girl's figure always came between. All he knew was that the face was that of a man, and this was quite enough to make him madly jealous. This was the doing of the fairies, and we must suppose that they had their reasons for acting as they did. When these things happened, Saphir was about 18 years old, and 15 years had passed away since the death of his mother. King Peridor had grown more and more unhappy as time went on, and at last he fell so ill that it seemed as if his days were numbered. He was so much beloved by his subjects that this sad news was heard with despair by the nation, and more than all by the prince. During his whole illness the king never spoke of anything but the queen, his sorrow at having grieved her, and his hope of one day seeing her again. All the doctors and all the water cures in the kingdom had been tried, and nothing would do him any good. At last he persuaded them to let him lie quietly in his room, where no one came to trouble him. Perhaps the worst pain he had to bear was a sort of weight on his chest, which made it very hard for him to breathe. So he commanded his servants to leave the windows open, in order that he might get more air. One day, when he had been left alone for a few minutes, a bird with brilliant plumage came and fluttered round the window, and finally rested on the sill. His feathers were sky blue and gold, his feet and his beak of such glittering rubies that no one could bear to look at them. His eyes made the brightest diamonds look dull, and on his head he wore a crown. I cannot tell you what the crown was made of, but I am quite certain that it was still more splendid than all the rest. As to his voice, I can say nothing about that, for the bird never sang at all. In fact, he did nothing but gaze steadily at the king, and as he gazed, the king felt his strength come back to him. In a little while the bird flew into the room, still with his eyes fixed on the king, and at every glance the strength of the sick man became greater, till he was once more as well as he used to be before the queen died. Filled with joy at his cure, he tried to seize the bird to whom he owed it all, but swifter than a swallow it managed to avoid him. In vain he described the bird to his attendants, who rushed at his first call. In vain they sought the wonderful creature both on horse and foot, and summoned the fowlers to their aid. The bird could nowhere be found. The love the people bore King Peridor was so strong, and the reward he promised was so large, that in the twinkling of an eye every man, woman, and child had fled into the fields, and the towns were quite empty. All this bustle, however, ended in nothing but confusion, and, what was worse, the king soon fell back into the same condition as he was in before. Prince Saphir, who loved his father very dearly, was so unhappy at this that he persuaded himself that he might succeed where the others had failed, and at once prepared himself for a more distant search. In spite of the opposition he met with, he rode away, followed by his household, trusting to chance to help him. He had formed no plan, and there was no reason that he should choose one path more than another. His only idea was to make straight for those spots which were the favourite haunts of birds. But in vain he examined all the hedges and all the thickets. In vain he questioned everyone he met along the road. The more he sought, the less he found. At last he came to one of the largest forests in all the world, composed entirely of cedars. But in spite of the deep shadows cast by the wide-spreading branches of the trees, the grass underneath was soft and green and covered with the rarest flowers. It seemed to Saphir that this was exactly the place where the birds would choose to live, and he determined not to quit the wood until he had examined it from end to end. And he did more. He ordered some nets to be prepared and painted of the same colours as the bird's plumage, thinking that we are all easily caught by what is like ourselves. In this he had to help him not only the fowlers by profession, but also his attendants, who excelled in this art. For a man is not a courtier unless he can do everything. After searching as usual for nearly a whole day, Prince Saphir began to feel overcome with thirst. He was too tired to go any farther, when happily he discovered a little way off a bubbling fountain of the clearest water. Being an experienced traveller, he drew from his pocket a little cup, without which no one should ever take a journey, and was just about to dip it in the water, when a lovely little green frog, much prettier than frogs generally are, jumped into the cup. Far from admiring its beauty, Saphir shook it impatiently off. But it was no good, for quick as lightning the frog jumped back again. Saphir, who was raging with thirst, was just about to shake it off anew, when the little creature fixed upon him the most beautiful eyes in the world, and said, "I am a friend of the bird you are seeking, and when you have quenched your thirst, listen to me." So the prince drank his fill, and then, by the command of the little green frog, he lay down on the grass to rest himself. "Now," she began, "be sure you do exactly in every respect what I tell you. First, you must call together your attendants and order them to remain in a little hamlet close by until you want them. Then go, quite alone, down a road that you will find on your right hand, looking southwards. This road is planted all the way with cedars of Lebanon, and after going down it a long way, you will come at last to a magnificent castle. And now," she went on, "attend carefully to what I am going to say. Take this tiny grain of sand and put it into the ground as close as you can to the gate of the castle. It has the virtue both of opening the gate and also of sending to sleep all the inhabitants. Then go at once to the stable, and pay no heed to anything except what I tell you. Choose the handsomest of all the horses, leap quickly on its back, and come to me as fast as you can. Farewell, Prince. I wish you good luck." And with these words the little frog plunged into the water and disappeared. The prince, who felt more hopeful than he had done since he left home, did precisely as he had been ordered. He left his attendants in the hamlet, found the road the frog had described to him, and followed it all alone, and at last he arrived at the gate of the castle, which was even more splendid than he had expected, for it was built of crystal, and all its ornaments were of massive gold. However, he had no thoughts to spare for its beauty, and quickly buried his grain of sand in the earth. In one instant the gates flew open, and all the dwellers inside fell sound asleep. Saphir flew straight to the stable, and already had his hand on the finest horse it contained, when his eye was caught by a suit of magnificent harness hanging up close by. It occurred to him directly that the harness belonged to the horse, and without ever thinking of harm, for indeed he who steals a horse can hardly be blamed for taking his saddle, he hastily placed it on the animal's back. Suddenly the people in the castle became broad awake and rushed to the stable. They flung themselves on the prince, seized him, and dragged him before their lord. But, luckily for the prince, who could only find very lame excuses for his conduct, the lord of the castle took a fancy to his face and let him depart without further questions, very sad and very much ashamed of himself. Poor Saphir crept back to the fountain, where the frog was awaiting him with a good scolding. "Whom do you take me for?" she exclaimed angrily. "Do you really believe that it was just for the pleasure of talking that I gave you the advice you have neglected so abominably?" But the prince was so deeply grieved, and apologized so very humbly, that after some time the heart of the good little frog was softened, and she gave him another tiny little grain. But instead of being sand, it was now a grain of gold. She directed him to do just as he had done before, with only this difference, that instead of going to the stable which had been the ruin of his hopes, he was to enter right into the castle itself, and to glide as fast as he could down the passages till he came to a room filled with perfume, where he would find a beautiful maiden asleep on a bed. He was to wake the maiden instantly and carry her off, and to be sure not to pay any heed to whatever resistance she might make. The prince obeyed the frog's orders one by one, and all went well, for this second time also. The gate opened, the inhabitants fell sound asleep, and he walked down the passage till he found the girl on her bed, exactly as he had been told he would. He woke her and begged her firmly, but politely, to follow him quickly. After a little persuasion the maiden consented, but only on condition that she was allowed first to put on her dress. This sounded so reasonable and natural that it did not enter the prince's head to refuse her request. But the maiden's hand had hardly touched the dress when the palace suddenly awoke from its sleep, and the prince was seized and bound. He was so vexed with his own folly, and so taken aback at the disaster, that he did not attempt to explain his conduct, and things would have gone badly with him if his friends, the fairies, had not softened the hearts of his captors so that they once more allowed him to leave quietly. However, what troubled him most was the idea of having to meet the frog who had been his benefactress. How was he ever to appear before her with this tale? Still, after a long struggle with himself, he made up his mind that there was nothing else to be done, and that he deserved whatever she might say to him. And she said a great deal, for she had worked herself into a terrible passion. But the prince humbly implored her pardon, and ventured to point out that it would have been very hard to refuse the young lady's reasonable request. "You must learn to do as you are told," was all the frog would reply. But poor Saphir was so unhappy and begged so hard for forgiveness that at last the frog's anger gave way, and she held up to him a tiny diamond stone. "Go back," she said, "to the castle, and bury this little diamond close to the door. But be careful not to return to the stable or to the bedroom. They have proved too fatal to you. Walk straight to the garden, and enter through a portico into a small green wood, in the midst of which is a tree with a trunk of gold and leaves of emeralds. Perched on this tree, you will see the beautiful bird you had been seeking so long. You must cut the branch on which it is sitting, and bring it back to me without delay. But I warn you solemnly that if you disobey my directions, as you have done twice before, You have nothing more to expect either of me or anyone else." With these words she jumped into the water, and the prince, who had taken her threats much to heart, took his departure, firmly resolved not to deserve them. He found it all just as he had been told: the portico, the wood, the magnificent tree, and the beautiful bird, which was sleeping soundly on one of the branches. He speedily lopped off the branch, and though he noticed a splendid golden cage hanging close by, which would have been very useful for the bird to travel in, he left it alone and came back to the fountain, holding his breath and walking on tiptoe all the way, for fear lest he should awake his prize. But what was his surprise when, instead of finding the fountain in the spot where he had left it, he saw in its place a little rustic palace built in the best taste, and standing in the doorway a charming maiden, at whose sight his mind seemed to give way. "What, madam," he cried, hardly knowing what he said, "what, is it you?" The maiden blushed and answered, "Ah, my lord, it is long since I first beheld your face, but I did not think you had ever seen mine." "Oh, madam," replied he, "you can never guess the days and the hours I have passed lost in admiration of you." And after these words they each related all the strange things that had happened, and the more they talked, the more they felt convinced of the truth of the images they had seen in their mirrors. After some time spent in the most tender conversation, the prince could not restrain himself from asking the lovely unknown by what lucky chance she was wandering in the forest where the fountain had gone, and if she knew anything of the frog to whom he owed all his happiness and to whom he must give up the bird, which, somehow or other, was still sound asleep. "Ah, my lord," she replied with rather an awkward air, "as to the frog, she stands before you. Let me tell you my story. It is not a long one. I know neither my country nor my parents, and the only thing I can say for certain is that I am called Serpentine. The fairies, who have taken care of me ever since I was born, wished me to be in ignorance as to my family, but they have looked after my education and have bestowed on me endless kindness. I have always lived in seclusion, and for the last 2 years I have wished for nothing better. I had a mirror." Here shyness and embarrassment choked her words, but regaining her self-control, she added, "You know that fairies insist on being obeyed without questioning. It was they who changed the little house you saw before you into the fountain for which you are now asking, and, having turned me into a frog, they ordered me to say to the first person who came to the fountain exactly what I repeated to you. But, my lord, when you stood before me, it was agony to my heart, filled as it was with thoughts of you, to appear to your eyes under so monstrous a form. However, there was no help for it, and, painful as it was, I had to submit. I desired your success with all my soul, not only for your own sake, but also for my own, because I could not get back my proper shape till you had become master of the beautiful bird, though I am quite ignorant as to your reason for seeking it." On this, Sophia explained about the state of his father's health, and all that has been told before. On hearing this story, Serpentine grew very sad, and her lovely eyes filled with tears. "Ah, my lord," she said, "you know nothing of me but what you have seen in the mirror, and I, who cannot even name my parents, learn that you are a king's son." In vain, Sophia declared that love made them equal. Serpentine would only reply, "I love you too much to allow you to marry beneath your rank. I shall be very unhappy, of course, but I shall never alter my mind. If I do not find from the fairies that my birth is worthy of you, then, whatever be my feelings, I will never accept your hand." The conversation was at this point, and bid fair to last some time longer, when one of the fairies appeared in her ivory car, accompanied by a beautiful woman past her early youth. At this moment the bird suddenly awakened, and, flying onto Sophia's shoulder, which it never afterwards left, began fondling him as well as a bird can do. The fairy told Serpentine that she was quite satisfied with her conduct, and made herself very agreeable to Sophia, whom she presented to the lady she had brought with her, explaining that the lady was no other than his Aunt Eglantine, widow of Diamantino. Then they all fell into each other's arms, till the fairy mounted her chariot, placed Eglantine by her side, and Saphir and Serpentine on the front seat. She also sent a message to the prince's attendants that they might travel slowly back to the court of King Peridor, and that the beautiful bird had really been found. This matter being comfortably arranged, she started off her chariot. But in spite of the swiftness with which they flew through the air, the time passed even quicker for Sophia and Serpentine, who had so much to think about. They were still quite confused with the pleasure of seeing each other, when the chariot arrived at King Peridor's palace. He had had himself carried to a room on the roof where his nurses thought that he would die at any moment. Directly the chariot drew within sight of the castle, the beautiful bird took flight, and, making straight for the dying king, at once cured him of his sickness. Then she resumed her natural shape, and he found that the bird was no other than the Queen Constance, whom he had long believed to be dead. Peridor was rejoiced to embrace his wife and his son once more, and with the help of the fairies began to make preparations for the marriage of Saphir and Serpentine, who turned out to be the daughter of Eglantine and Diamantino, and as much a princess as he was a prince. The people of the kingdom were delighted, and everybody lived happy and contented to the end of their lives. The Magic Ring. Once upon a time there lived an old couple who had one son called Martin. Now when the old man's time had come, he stretched himself out on his bed and died. Though all his life long he had toiled and moiled, he only left his widow and son 200 florins. The old woman determined to put by the money for a rainy day, but alas! The rainy day was close at hand, for their meal was all consumed. And who is prepared to face starvation with 200 florins at their disposal? So the old woman counted out 100 of her florins, and giving them to Martin, told him to go into the town and lay in a store of meal for a year. So Martin started off for the town. When he reached the meat market, he found the whole place in turmoil, and a great noise of angry voices and barking of dogs. Mixing in the crowd, he noticed a staghound, which the butchers had caught and tied to a post, and which was being flogged in a merciless manner. Overcome with pity, Martin spoke to the butchers, saying, "Friends, why are you beating the poor dog so cruelly?" "We have every right to beat him," they replied. "He has just devoured a newly killed pig." "Leave off beating him," said Martin, "and sell him to me instead." "If you choose to buy him," answered the butchers derisively, "but for such a treasure we won't take a penny less than 100 florins." 100! exclaimed Martin. "Well, so be it, if you will not take less," and, taking the money out of his pocket, he handed it over in exchange for the dog, whose name was Shirka. When Martin got home, his mother met him with the question, "Well, what have you bought?" "Shirka, the dog," replied Martin, pointing to his new possession, whereupon his mother became very angry and abused him roundly. He ought to be ashamed of himself, when there was scarcely a handful of meal in the house, to have spent the money on a useless brute like that. On the following day she sent him back to the town, saying, "Here, take our last 100 florins and buy provisions with them. I have just emptied the last grains of meal out of the chest and baked a bannock, but it won't last over tomorrow." Just as Martin was entering the town, he met a rough-looking peasant who was dragging a cat after him by a string which was fastened round the poor beast's neck. "Stop!" cried Martin. "Where are you dragging that poor cat?" "I mean to drown him," was the answer. "What harm has the poor beast done?" said Martin. "It has just killed a goose," replied the peasant. "Don't drown him, sell him to me instead," begged Martin. "Not for 100 florins," was the answer. "Surely for 100 florins you'll sell it?" said Martin. "See, here is the money." And, so saying, he handed him the 100 florins, which the peasant pocketed, and Martin took possession of the cat, which was called Waska. When he reached his home, his mother greeted him with the question, "Well, what have you brought back?" "I have brought this cat Waska," answered Martin. "And what besides?" "I had no money over to buy anything else with," replied Martin. "You useless ne'er-do-weel," exclaimed his mother in a great passion. "Leave the house at once, and go and beg your bread among strangers." And as Martin did not dare to contradict her, he called Shurka and Waska and started off with them to the nearest village in search of work. On the way he met a rich peasant, who asked him where he was going. "I want to get work as a day labourer," he answered. "Come along with me then. But I must tell you, I engage my labourers without wages. If you serve me faithfully for a year, I promise you it shall be for your advantage." So Martin consented, and for a year he worked diligently and served his master faithfully, not sparing himself in any way. When the day of reckoning had come, the peasant led him into a barn, and pointing to 2 full sacks said, "Take whichever of these you choose." Martin examined the contents of the sacks, and seeing that one was full of silver and the other of sand, he said to himself, "There must be some trick about this. I had better take the sand." And throwing the sack over his shoulders, he started out into the world in search of fresh work. On and on he walked, and at last he reached a great gloomy wood. In the middle of the wood he came upon a meadow where a fire was burning, and in the midst of the fire, surrounded by flames, was a lovely damsel, more beautiful than anything that Martin had ever seen. And when she saw him, she called to him, "Martin, if you would win happiness, save my life. Extinguish the flames with the sand that you earned in payment of your faithful service." "Truly," thought Martin to himself, "it would be more sensible to save a fellow being's life with this sand than to drag it about on one's back, seeing what a weight it is." And forthwith he lowered the sack from his shoulders and emptied its contents on the flames, and instantly the fire was extinguished. But at the same moment, lo! And behold, the lovely damsel turned into a serpent, and, darting upon him, coiled itself round his neck, and whispered lovingly in his ear, "Do not be afraid of me, Martin. I love you, and will go with you through the world. But first you must follow me boldly into my Father's kingdom, underneath the earth, and when we get there, remember this: he will offer you gold and silver and dazzling gems, but do not touch them. Ask him instead for the ring which he wears on his little finger, for in that ring lies a magic power. You have only to throw it from one hand to the other, and at once 12 young men will appear, who will do your bidding, no matter how difficult, in a single night." So they started on their way, and after much wandering they reached a spot where a great rock rose straight up in the middle of the road. Instantly the serpent uncoiled itself from his neck, and, as it touched the damp earth, it resumed the shape of the lovely damsel. Pointing to the rock, she showed him an opening just big enough for a man to wriggle through. Passing into it, they entered a long underground passage, which led out onto a wide field, above which spread a blue sky. In the middle of the field stood a magnificent castle, built out of porphyry, with a roof of gold and with glittering battlements. and his beautiful guide told him that this was the palace in which her father lived and reigned over his kingdom in the underworld. Together they entered the palace and were received by the king with great kindness. Turning to his daughter, he said, "My child, I had almost given up the hope of ever seeing you again. Where have you been all these years?" "My father," she replied, "I owe my life to this youth, who saved me from a terrible death." Upon which the king turned to Martin with a gracious smile, saying, "I will reward your courage by granting you whatever your heart desires. Take as much gold, silver, and precious stones as you choose." "I thank you, mighty king, for your gracious offer," answered Martin, "but I do not covet either gold, silver, or precious stones. Yet, if you will grant me a favor, give me, I beg, the ring from off the little finger of your royal hand. Every time my eye falls on it, I shall think of your gracious majesty, and when I marry, I shall present it to my bride." So the king took the ring from his finger and gave it to Martin, saying, "Take it, good youth, but with it I make one condition. You are never to confide to anyone that this is a magic ring. If you do, you will straightway bring misfortune on yourself." Martin took the ring, and, having thanked the king, he set out on the same road by which he had come down into the underworld. When he had regained the upper air, he started for his old home, and having found his mother still living in the old house where he had left her, they settled down together very happily. So uneventful was their life that it almost seemed as if it would go on in this way, always, without let or hindrance. But one day it suddenly came into his mind that he would like to get married, and, moreover, that he would choose a very grand wife. A king's daughter, in short. But as he did not trust himself as a wooer, he determined to send his old mother on the mission. "You must go to the king," he said to her, "and demand the hand of his lovely daughter in marriage for me." "What are you thinking of, my son?" answered the old woman, aghast at the idea. "Why cannot you marry someone in your own rank? That would be far more fitting than to send a poor old woman like me a-wooing to the king's court for the hand of a princess. Why, it is as much as our heads are worth. Neither my life nor yours would be worth anything if I went on such a fool's errand." "Never fear, little mother," answered Martin. "Trust me, all will be well. But see that you do not come back without an answer of some kind." And so, obedient to her son's behest, the old woman hobbled off to the palace, and, without being hindered, reached the courtyard, and began to mount the flight of steps leading to the royal presence chamber. At the head of the landing rows of courtiers were collected in magnificent attire, who stared at the queer old figure, and called to her, and explained to her, with every kind of sign, that it was strictly forbidden to mount those steps. But their stern words and forbidding gestures made no impression whatever on the old woman, and she resolutely continued to climb the stairs, bent on carrying out her son's orders. Upon this, some of the courtiers seized her by the arms, and held her back by sheer force, at which she set up such a yell that the king himself heard it, and stepped out onto the balcony to see what was the matter. When he beheld the old woman flinging her arms wildly about, and heard her scream that she would not leave the place till she had laid her case before the king, he ordered that she should be brought into his presence, and forthwith she was conducted into the golden presence chamber, where, leaning back amongst cushions of royal purple, the king sat, surrounded by his counselors and courtiers. Courtesying low, the old woman stood silent before him. "Well, my good old dame, what can I do for you?" asked the king. "I hath come," replied Martin's mother, "and your majesty must not be angry with me. I hath come a-wooing." "Is the woman out of her mind?" said the king with an angry frown. But Martin's mother answered boldly, "If the king will only listen patiently to me and give me a straightforward answer, he will see that I am not out of my mind. You, O king, have a lovely daughter to give in marriage. I have a son, a wooer, as clever a youth and as good a son-in-law as you will find in your whole kingdom. There is nothing that he cannot do. Now tell me, O king, plump and plain, will you give your daughter to my son as wife?" The king listened to the end of the old woman's strange request, but every moment his face grew blacker and his features sterner, till all at once he thought to himself, "Is it worth while that I, the king, should be angry with this poor old fool?" And all the courtiers and councillors were amazed when they saw the hard lines round his mouth and the frown on his brow grow smooth, and heard the mild but mocking tones in which he answered the old woman, saying, "If your son is as wonderfully clever as you say, and if there is nothing in the world that he cannot do, let him build a magnificent castle just opposite my palace windows in 24 hours. The palace must be joined together by a bridge of pure crystal. On each side of the bridge there must be growing trees, having golden and silver apples, and with birds of paradise among the branches. At the right of the bridge there must be a church, with 5 golden cupolas. In this church your son shall be wedded to my daughter, and we will keep the wedding festivities in the new castle. But if he fails to execute this, my royal command, then, as a just but mild monarch, I shall give orders that you and he are taken, and first dipped in tar, and then in feathers. And you shall be executed in the marketplace for the entertainment of my courtiers." And a smile played round the king's lips as he finished speaking, and his courtiers and councillors shook with laughter when they thought of the old woman's folly, and praised the king's wise device, and said to each other, "What a joke it will be when we see the pair of them tarred and feathered. The son is just as able to grow a beard on the palm of his hand as to execute such a task in 24 hours. Now, the poor old woman was mortally afraid, and, in a trembling voice, she asked, "Is that really your royal will, O king? Must I take this order to my poor son?" "Yes, old dame, such is my command. If your son carries out my order, he shall be rewarded with my daughter. But if he fails, away to the tar barrel and the stake with you both." On her way home, the poor old woman shed bitter tears, and when she saw Martin she told him what the king had said, and sobbed out, "Didn't I tell you, my son, that you should marry someone of your own rank? It would have been better for us this day if you had. As I told you, my going to court has been as much as our lives are worth, and now we will both be tarred and feathered and burnt in the public marketplace. It is terrible." And she moaned and cried. "Never fear, little mother," answered Martin. "Trust me, and you will see all will be well. You may go to sleep with a quiet mind." And, stepping to the front of the hut, Martin threw his ring from the palm of one hand into the other, upon which 12 youths instantly appeared, and demanded what he wanted them to do. Then he told them the king's commands, and they answered that by next morning all should be accomplished exactly as the king had ordered. Next morning, when the king awoke and looked out of his window, to his amazement he beheld a magnificent castle just opposite his own palace, and joined to it a bridge of pure crystal. At each side of the bridge trees were growing, from whose branches hung golden and silver apples, among which birds of paradise perched. At the right, gleaming in the sun, were the 5 golden cupolas of a splendid church, whose bells rang out, as if they would summon people from all corners of the earth to come and behold the wonder. Now, though the king would much rather have seen his future son-in-law tarred, feathered, and burnt at the stake, he remembered his royal oath, and had to make the best of a bad business. So he took heart of grace and made Martin a duke, and gave his daughter a rich dowry, and prepared the grandest wedding feast that had ever been seen, so that to this day the old people in the country still talk of it. After the wedding, Martin and his royal bride went to dwell in the magnificent new palace, and here Martin lived in the greatest comfort and luxury, such luxury as he had never imagined. But though he was as happy as the day was long, and as merry as a grig, the king's daughter fretted all day, thinking of the indignity that had been done her in making her marry Martin, the poor widow's son, instead of a rich young prince from a foreign country. So unhappy was she that she spent all her time wondering how she should get rid of her undesirable husband. And first she determined to learn the secret of his power, and, with flattering, caressing words, she tried to coax him to tell her how he was so clever that there was nothing in the world that he could not do. At first he would tell her nothing, but once, when he was in a yielding mood, she approached him with a winning smile on her lovely face, and, speaking flattering words to him, she gave him a potion to drink with a sweet, strong taste. And when he had drunk it, Martin's lips were unsealed, and he told her that all his power lay in the magic ring that he wore on his finger, and he described to her how to use it. And, still speaking, he fell into a deep sleep. And when she saw that the potion had worked, and that he was sound asleep, the princess took the magic ring from his finger, and, going into the courtyard, she threw it from the palm of one hand into the other. On the instant the 12 youths appeared, and asked her what she commanded them to do. Then she told them that by the next morning they were to do away with the castle, and the bridge, and the church, and put in their stead the humble hut in which Martin used to live with his mother, and that while he slept her husband was to be carried to his old lowly room, and that they were to bear her away to the utmost ends of the earth, where an old king lived who would make her welcome in his palace, and surround her with the state that befitted a royal princess. "You shall be obeyed," answered the 12 youths at the same moment, and lo and behold! The following morning, when the king awoke and looked out of his window, he beheld to his amazement that the palace, bridge, church, and trees had all vanished, and there was nothing in their place but a bare, miserable-looking hut. Immediately the king sent for his son-in-law and commanded him to explain what had happened. But Martin looked at his royal father-in-law and answered never a word. Then the king was very angry, and, calling a council together, he charged Martin with having been guilty of witchcraft, and of having deceived the king, and having made away with the princess. And he was condemned to imprisonment in a high stone tower, with neither meat nor drink, till he should die of starvation. Then, in the hour of his dire necessity, his old friends Shurka the dog and Waska the cat remembered how Martin had once saved them from a cruel death, and they took counsel together as to how they should help him. And Shurka growled, and was of opinion that he would like to tear everyone in pieces, but Waska purred meditatively, and scratched the back of her ear with a velvet paw, and remained lost in thought. At the end of a few minutes she had made up her mind, and, turning to Shurka, said, "Let us go together into the town, and the moment we meet a baker, you must make a rush between his legs and upset the tray from off his head. I will lay hold of the rolls, and will carry them off to our master." No sooner said than done. Together the two faithful creatures trotted off into the town, and very soon they met a baker bearing a tray on his head, and looking round on all sides, while he cried, "Fresh rolls, sweet cake, fancy bread of every kind." Come and buy, come and take. Sure you'll find it to your mind." At that moment, Shirker made a rush between his legs. The baker stumbled, the tray was upset, the rolls fell to the ground, and, while the man angrily pursued Shirker, Waska managed to drag the rolls out of sight behind a bush. And when a moment later Shirker joined her, they set off at full tilt to the stone tower where Martin was a prisoner, taking the rolls with them. Waska, being very agile, climbed up by the outside to the grated window and called in an anxious voice, "Are you alive, master?" "Scarcely alive. Almost starved to death," answered Martin in a weak voice. "I little thought it would come to this, that I should die of hunger." "Never fear, dear master. Shirker and I will look after you," said Waska, and in another moment she had climbed down and brought him back a roll, and then another, and another, till she had brought him the whole tray-load. Upon which she said, "Dear master, Shirker and I are going off to a distant kingdom at the utmost ends of the earth to fetch you back your magic ring. You must be careful that the rolls last till our return." And Waska took leave of her beloved master and set off with Shirker on their journey. On and on they travelled, looking always to right and left for traces of the princess, following up every track, making inquiries of every cat and dog they met, listening to the talk of every wayfarer they passed. And at last they heard that the kingdom at the utmost ends of the earth, where the 12 youths had borne the princess, was not very far off. And at last, one day, they reached that distant kingdom, and, going at once to the palace, they began to make friends with all the dogs and cats in the place, and to question them about the princess and the magic ring. But no one could tell them much about either. Now one day it chanced that Waska had gone down to the palace cellar to hunt for mice and rats, and seeing an especially fat, well-fed mouse, she pounced upon it, buried her claws in its soft fur, and was just going to gobble it up, when she was stopped by the pleading tones of the little creature, saying, "If you will only spare my life, I may be of great service to you. I will do everything in my power for you, for I am the king of the mice, and if I perish, the whole race will die out." "So be it," said Waska. "I will spare your life, but in return you must do something for me. In this castle there lives a princess, the wicked wife of my dear master. She has stolen away his magic ring. You must get it away from her at whatever cost. Do you hear? Till you have done this, I won't take my claws out of your fur." "Good," replied the mouse. "I will do what you ask." And, so saying, he summoned all the mice in his kingdom together. A countless number of mice, small and big, brown and grey, assembled and formed a circle round their king, who was a prisoner under Waska's claws. Turning to them, he said, "Dear and faithful subjects, whoever among you will steal the magic ring from the strange princess will release me from a cruel death, and I shall honour him above all the other mice in the kingdom." Instantly, a tiny mouse stepped forward and said, "I often creep about the princess's bedroom at night, and I have noticed that she has a ring which she treasures as the apple of her eye. All day she wears it on her finger, and at night she keeps it in her mouth. I will undertake, sire, to steal away the ring for you." And the tiny mouse tripped away into the bedroom of the princess, and waited for nightfall. Then, when the princess had fallen asleep, it crept up onto her bed and gnawed a hole in the pillow, through which it dragged one by one little down feathers, and threw them under the princess's nose. And the fluff flew into the princess's nose and into her mouth, and starting up she sneezed and coughed, and the ring fell out of her mouth onto the coverlet. In a flash, the tiny mouse had seized it, and brought it to Waska as a ransom for the king of the mice. Thereupon Waska and Shurka started off and travelled night and day till they reached the stone tower where Martin was imprisoned, and the cat climbed up the window and called out to him, "Martin, dear master, are you still alive?" "Ah, Waska, my faithful little cat, is that you?" replied a weak voice. "I am dying of hunger. For 3 days I have not tasted food." "Be of good heart, dear master," replied Waska. "From this day forth you will know nothing but happiness and prosperity. If this were a moment to trouble you with riddles, I would make you guess what Shurka and I have brought you back. Only think, we have got you your ring." At these words, Martin's joy knew no bounds, and he stroked her fondly, and she rubbed up against him and purred happily, while below, Shurka bounded in the air and barked joyfully. Then Martin took the ring and threw it from one hand into the other, and instantly the 12 youths appeared and asked what they were to do. "Fetch me first something to eat and drink as quickly as possible, and after that bring musicians hither, and let us have music all day long." Now when the people in the town and palace heard music coming from the tower, they were filled with amazement, and came to the king with the news that witchcraft must be going on in Martin's tower, for instead of dying of starvation, he was seemingly making merry to the sound of music, and to the clatter of plates and glass and knives and forks, and the music was so enchantingly sweet that all the passers-by stood still to listen to it. On this the king sent at once a messenger to the Starvation Tower, and he was so astonished with what he saw that he remained rooted to the spot. Then the king sent his chief counselors, and they too were transfixed with wonder. At last the king came himself, and he likewise was spellbound by the beauty of the music. Then Martin summoned the 12 youths, spoke to them, saying, "Build up my castle again, and join it to the king's palace with a crystal bridge. Do not forget the trees with the golden and silver apples, and with the birds of paradise in the branches. And put back the church with the 5 cupolas, and let the bells ring out, summoning the people from the 4 corners of the kingdom. And one thing more, bring back my faithless wife, and lead her into the women's chamber." And it was all done as he commanded, and, leaving the Starvation Tower, he took the king, his father-in-law, by the arm, and led him into the new palace, where the princess sat in fear and trembling, awaiting her death. And Martin spoke to the king, saying, "King and royal father, I have suffered much at the hands of your daughter. What punishment shall be dealt to her?" Then the mild king answered, "Beloved prince and son-in-law, if you love me, let your anger be turned to grace. Forgive my daughter, and restore her to your heart and favour." And Martin's heart was softened, and he forgave his wife, and they lived happily together ever after. And his old mother came and lived with him, and he never parted with Shurka and Waska, and I need hardly tell you that he never again let the ring out of his possession. The Nightingale. In China, as I dare say you know, the emperor is a Chinaman, and all his courtiers are also Chinamen. The story I am going to tell you happened many years ago, but it is worthwhile for you to listen to it before it is forgotten. The emperor's palace was the most splendid in the world, all made of priceless porcelain, but so brittle and delicate that you had to take great care how you touched it. In the garden were the most beautiful flowers, and on the loveliest of them were tied silver bells which tinkled, so that if you passed, you could not help looking at the flowers. Everything in the emperor's garden was admirably arranged with a view to effect, and the garden was so large that even the gardener himself did not know where it ended. If you ever got beyond it, you came to a stately forest with great trees and deep lakes in it. The forest sloped down to the sea, which was a clear blue. Large ships could sail under the boughs of the trees, and in these trees there lived a nightingale. She sang so beautifully that even the poor fisherman, who had so much to do, stood and listened when he came at night to cast his nets. "How beautiful it is," he said, but he had to attend to his work and forgot about the bird. But when she sang the next night, and the fisherman came there again, he said the same thing. "How beautiful it is!" From all the countries round came travellers to the emperor's town, who were astonished at the palace and the garden. But when they heard the nightingale, they all said, "This is the finest thing after all." The travellers told all about it when they went home, and learned scholars wrote many books upon the town, the palace, and the garden. But they did not forget the nightingale. She was praised the most, and all the poets composed splendid verses on the nightingale in the forest by the deep sea. The books were circulated throughout the world, and some of them reached the emperor. He sat in his golden chair and read and read. He nodded his head every moment, for he liked reading the brilliant accounts of the town, the palace, and the garden. But the nightingale is better than all, he saw written. "What is that?" said the emperor. "I don't know anything about the nightingale. Is there such a bird in my empire? And so near as in my garden? I have never heard it. Fancy reading for the first time about it in a book." And he called his first lord to him. He was so proud that if anyone of lower rank than his own ventured to speak to him or ask him anything, he would say nothing but "Pea." And that does not mean anything. "Here is a most remarkable bird which is called a nightingale," said the emperor. "They say it is the most glorious thing in my kingdom. Why has no one ever said anything to me about it?" "I have never before heard it mentioned," said the first lord. "I will look for it and find it." But where was it to be found? The first lord ran up and down stairs, through the halls and corridors, but none of those he met had ever heard of the nightingale. And the first lord ran again to the emperor and told him that it must be an invention on the part of those who had written the books. "Your Imperial Majesty cannot really believe all that is written. There are some inventions called the black art." "But the book in which I read this," said the emperor, "is sent me by His Great Majesty, the Emperor of Japan. So it cannot be untrue, and I will hear the nightingale. She must be here this evening. She has my gracious permission to appear, and if she does not, the whole court shall be trampled under foot after supper." "Xing Pei," said the first lord, and he ran up and down stairs, through the halls and corridors, and half the court ran with him, for they did not want to be trampled underfoot. Everyone was asking after the wonderful nightingale which all the world knew of, except those at court. At last they met a poor little girl in the kitchen who said, "Oh, I know the nightingale well. How she sings! I have permission to carry the scraps over from the court meals to my poor sick mother. And when I am going home at night, tired and weary, and rest for a little in the wood, then I hear the nightingale singing. It brings tears to my eyes, and I feel as if my mother were kissing me." "Little kitchen maid," said the first lord, "I will give you a place in the kitchen, and you shall have leave to see the emperor at dinner, if you can lead us to the nightingale, for she is invited to come to court this evening." And so they all went into the wood where the nightingale was wont to sing, and half the court went too. When they were on the way there, they heard a cow mooing. "Oh," said the courtiers, "now we have found her. What a wonderful power for such a small beast to have. I am sure we have heard her before." "No, that is a cow mooing," said the little kitchen maid. "We are still a long way off." Then the frogs began to croak in the marsh. "Splendid," said the Chinese chaplain. "Now we hear her, it sounds like a little church bell." No, "Those are frogs," said the little kitchen maid, "but I think we shall soon hear her now." Then the nightingale began to sing. "There she is," cried the little girl. "Listen, she is sitting there." And she pointed to a little dark grey bird up in the branches. "Is it possible?" said the First Lord. "I should never have thought it. How ordinary she looks! She must surely have lost her feathers, because she sees so many distinguished men round her." "Little nightingale," called out the little kitchen maid, "our gracious emperor wants you to sing before him." "With the greatest of pleasure," said the nightingale, and she sang so gloriously that it was a pleasure to listen. "It sounds like glass bells," said the First Lord. "And look how her little throat works. It is wonderful that we have never heard her before. She will be a great success at court. Shall I sing once more for the emperor?" asked the nightingale, thinking that the emperor was there. "My esteemed little nightingale," said the First Lord, "I have the great pleasure to invite you to court this evening, where His Gracious Imperial Highness will be enchanted with your charming song." "It sounds best in the green wood," said the nightingale, but still she came gladly when she heard that the emperor wished it. At the palace everything was splendidly prepared. The porcelain walls and floors glittered in the light of many thousand gold lamps. The most gorgeous flowers, which tinkled out well, were placed in the corridors. There was such a hurrying and draught that all the bells jingled so much that one could not hear oneself speak. In the centre of the great hall where the emperor sat was a golden perch, on which the nightingale sat. The whole court was there, and the little kitchen maid was allowed to stand behind the door, now that she was a court cook. Everyone was dressed in his best, and everyone was looking towards the little grey bird, to whom the emperor nodded. The nightingale sang so gloriously that the tears came into the emperor's eyes and ran down his cheeks. Then the nightingale sang even more beautifully. It went straight to all hearts. The emperor was so delighted that he said she should wear his gold slipper round her neck. But the nightingale thanked him and said she had had enough reward already. "I have seen tears in the emperor's eyes. That is a great reward. An emperor's tears have such power." Then she sang again with her gloriously sweet voice. "That is the most charming coquetry I have ever seen," said all the ladies round, and they all took to holding water in their mouths, that they might gurgle whenever anyone spoke to them. Then they thought themselves nightingales. Yes, the lackeys and chambermaids announced that they were pleased, which means a great deal, for they are the most difficult people of all to satisfy. In short, the nightingale was a real success. She had to stay at court now. She had her own cage, and permission to walk out twice in the day and once at night. She was given 12 servants, who each held a silken string which was fastened round her leg. There was little pleasure in flying about like this. The whole town was talking about the wonderful bird, and when two people met each other, one would say "nightin" and the other "gale," and then they would both sigh and understand one another. Yes, and 11 grocers' children were called after her, but not one of them could sing a note. One day the emperor received a large parcel on which was written "The Nightingale." "Here is another new book about our famous bird," said the emperor, but it was not a book, but a little mechanical toy which lay in a box, an artificial nightingale which was like the real one, only that it was set all over with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. When it was wound up, it could sing the piece. The real bird sang, and moved its tail up and down, and glittered with silver and gold. Round its neck was a little collar on which was written, "The nightingale of the Emperor of Japan is nothing compared to that of the Emperor of China." "This is magnificent," they all said. and the man who had brought the clockwork bird received on the spot the title of bringer of the imperial first nightingale. Now they must sing together. What a duet we shall have! And so they sang together, but their voices did not blend, for the real nightingale sang in her way, and the clockwork bird sang waltzes. "It is not its fault," said the bandmaster. "It keeps very good time, and is quite after my style." Then the artificial bird had to sing alone. It gave just as much pleasure as the real one. And then it was so much prettier to look at. It sparkled like bracelets and necklaces. 33 times it sang the same piece without being tired. People would like to have heard it again, but the emperor thought that the living nightingale should sing now. But where was she? No one had noticed that she had flown out of the open window away to her green woods. "What shall we do?" said the emperor. And all the court scolded and said that the nightingale was very ungrateful. "But we have still the best bird," they said, and the artificial bird had to sing again, and that was the 34th time. They had heard the same piece. But they did not yet know it by heart. It was much too difficult. And the bandmaster praised the bird tremendously. Yes, he assured them it was better than a real nightingale, not only because of its beautiful plumage and diamonds, but inside as well. "For see, my lords and ladies, and your imperial majesty, with the real nightingale, one can never tell what will come out, but all is known about the artificial bird. You can explain it, you can open it, and show people where the waltzes lie, how they go, and how one follows the other." "That's just what we think," said everyone, and the bandmaster received permission to show the bird to the people the next Sunday. "They should hear it sing," commanded the emperor. And they heard it, and they were as pleased as if they had been intoxicated with tea, after the Chinese fashion, and they all said, "Oh," and held up their forefingers and nodded time. But the poor fishermen who had heard the real nightingale said, "This one sings well enough. The tunes glide out, but there is something wanting. I don't know what." The real nightingale was banished from the kingdom. The artificial bird was put on silken cushions by the emperor's bed. All the presents which it received, gold and precious stones, lay round it, and it was given the title of Imperial Night Singer, first from the left, for the emperor counted that side as the more distinguished, being the side on which the heart is. The emperor's heart is also on the left, and the bandmaster wrote a work of 25 volumes about the artificial bird. It was so learned, long, and so full of the hardest Chinese words that everyone said they had read it and understood it. For once they had been very stupid about a book, and had been trampled underfoot in consequence. So a whole year passed. The emperor, the court, and all the Chinese knew every note of the artificial bird's song by heart. But they liked it all the better for this. They could even sing with it, and they did. The street boys sang "Tra-la-la-la," and the emperor sang too sometimes. It was indeed delightful. But one evening, when the artificial bird was singing its best, and the emperor lay in bed listening to it, something in the bird went crack. Something snapped. Whir-ah-ah. All the wheels ran down, and then the music ceased. The emperor sprang up and had his physician summoned, but what could Heichi do? Then the clockmaker came, and, after a great deal of talking and examining, he put the bird somewhat in order, but he said that it must be very seldom used, as the works were nearly worn out, and it was impossible to put in new ones. Here was a calamity. Only once a year was the artificial bird allowed to sing, and even that was almost too much for it. But then the bandmaster made a little speech full of hard words, saying that it was just as good as before. And so, of course, it was just as good as before. So 5 years passed, and then a great sorrow came to the nation. The Chinese look upon their emperor as everything, and now he was ill, and not likely to live, it was said. Already a new emperor had been chosen, and the people stood outside in the street and asked the First Lord how the old emperor was. "Pee!" said he, and shook his head. Cold and pale lay the emperor in his splendid great bed. The whole court believed him dead, and one after the other left him to pay their respects to the new emperor. Everywhere in the halls and corridors cloth was laid down so that no footstep could be heard, and everything was still, very, very still. And nothing came to break the silence. The emperor longed for something to come and relieve the monotony of this death-like stillness. If only someone would speak to him. If only someone would sing to him. Music would carry his thoughts away and would break the spell lying on him. The moon was streaming in at the open window, but that, too, was silent, quite silent. "Music! Music!" cried the emperor. "You little bright golden bird, sing, do sing. I gave you gold and jewels. I have hung my gold slipper round your neck with my own hand. Sing, do sing." But the bird was silent. There was no one to wind it up, and so it could not sing. And all was silent, so terribly silent. All at once there came in at the window the most glorious burst of song. It was the little living nightingale, who, sitting outside on a bough, had heard the need of her emperor, and had come to sing to him of comfort and hope. And as she sang, the blood flowed quicker and quicker in the emperor's weak limbs, and life began to return. "Thank you, said the emperor. "You divine little bird. I know you. I chased you from my kingdom, and you have given me life again. How can I reward you?" "You have done that already," said the nightingale. "I brought tears to your eyes the first time I sang. I shall never forget that. They are jewels that rejoice a singer's heart. But now sleep and get strong again. I will sing you a lullaby." And the emperor fell into a deep, calm sleep as she sang. The sun was shining through the window when he awoke, strong and well. None of his servants had come back yet, for they thought he was dead. But the nightingale sat and sang to him. "You must always stay with me," said the emperor. "You shall sing whenever you like, and I will break the artificial bird into 1,000 pieces." "Don't do that," said the nightingale. He did his work as long as he could. "Keep him, as you have done. I cannot build my nest in the palace and live here, but let me come whenever I like. I will sit in the evening on the bough outside the window, and I will sing you something that will make you feel happy and grateful. I will sing of joy and of sorrow. I will sing of the evil and the good which lies hidden from you." The little singing bird flies all around, to the poor fisherman's hut, to the farmer's cottage, to all those who are far away from you and your court. I love your heart more than your crown, though that has about it a brightness as of something holy. Now I will sing to you again, but you must promise me one thing." "Anything," said the emperor, standing up in his imperial robes, which he had himself put on, and fastening on his sword richly embossed with gold. "One thing I beg of you. Don't tell anyone that you have a little bird who tells you everything. It will be much better not to." Then the nightingale flew away. The servants came in to look at their dead emperor. The emperor said, "Good morning." To Nixie. There was once upon a time a miller who was very well off, and had as much money and as many goods as he knew what to do with. But sorrow comes in the night, and the miller all of a sudden became so poor that at last he could hardly call the mill in which he sat his own. He wandered about all day, full of despair and misery, and when he lay down at night he could get no rest, but lay awake all night, sunk in sorrowful thoughts. One morning he rose up before dawn and went outside, for he thought his heart would be lighter in the open air. As he wandered up and down on the banks of the mill pond, he heard a rustling in the water, and when he looked near, he saw a white woman rising up from the waves. He realized at once that this could be none other than the nixie of the mill pond, and in his terror he didn't know if he should fly away or remain where he was. While he hesitated, the nixie spoke, called him by his name, and asked him why he was so sad. When the miller heard how friendly her tone was, he plucked up heart and told her how rich and prosperous he had been all his life up till now, when he didn't know what he was to do for want and misery. Then the nixie spoke comforting words to him, and promised that she would make him richer and more prosperous than he had ever been in his life before, if he would give her in return the youngest thing in his house. The miller thought she must mean one of his puppies or kittens, so promised the nixie at once what she asked, and returned to his mill full of hope. On the threshold he was greeted by a servant with the news that his wife had just given birth to a boy. The poor miller was much horrified by these tidings, and went in to his wife with a heavy heart to tell her and his relations of the fatal bargain he had just struck with the nixie. "I would gladly give up all the good fortune she promised me," he said, "if I could only save my child." But no one could think of any advice to give him, beyond taking care that the child never went near the mill pond. So the boy throve and grew big, and in the meantime all prospered with the miller, and in a few years he was richer than he had ever been before. But all the same, he did not enjoy his good fortune, for he could not forget his compact with the nixie, and he knew that sooner or later she would demand his fulfillment of it. But year after year went by, and the boy grew up and became a great hunter, and the lord of the land took him into his service, for he was as smart and bold a hunter as you would wish to see. In a short time he married a pretty young wife, and lived with her in great peace and happiness. One day, when he was out hunting, a hare sprang up at his feet, and ran for some way in front of him in the open field. The hunter pursued it hotly for some time, and at last shot it dead. Then he proceeded to skin it, never noticing that he was close to the mill pond, which from childhood up he had been taught to avoid. He soon finished the skinning, and went to the water to wash the blood off his hands. He had hardly dipped them in the pond when the nixie rose up in the water, and seizing him in her wet arms, she dragged him down with her under the waves. When the hunter did not come home in the evening, his wife grew very anxious, and when his game bag was found close to the mill pond, she guessed at once what had befallen him. She was nearly beside herself with grief, and roamed round and round the pond, calling on her husband without ceasing. At last, worn out with sorrow and fatigue, she fell asleep, and dreamt that she was wandering along a flowery meadow, when she came to a hut where she found an old witch, who promised to restore her husband to her. When she awoke next morning, she determined to set out and find the witch, so she wandered on for many a day, and at last she reached the flowery meadow and found the hut where the old witch lived. The poor wife told her all that had happened, and how she had been told in a dream of the witch's power to help her. The witch counselled her to go to the pond the first time there was a full moon, and to comb her black hair with a golden comb, and then to place the comb on the bank. The hunter's wife gave the witch a handsome present, thanked her heartily, and returned home. Time dragged heavily till the time of the full moon, but it passed at last, and as soon as it rose, the young wife went to the pond, combed her black hair with a golden comb, and when she had finished, placed the comb on the bank. Then she watched the water impatiently. Soon she heard a rushing sound, and a big wave rose suddenly and swept the comb off the bank, and a minute after the head of her husband rose from the pond and gazed sadly at her. But immediately another wave came, and the head sank back into the water without having said a word. The pond lay still and motionless, glittering in the moonshine, and the hunter's wife was not a bit better off than she had been before. In despair she wandered about for days and nights, and at last, worn out by fatigue, she sank once more into a deep sleep and dreamt exactly the same dream about the old witch. So, next morning, she went again to the flowery meadow and sought the witch in her hut and told her of her grief. The old woman counselled her to go to the mill pond the next full moon and play upon a golden flute, and then to lay the flute on the bank. As soon as the next moon was full, the hunter's wife went to the mill pond, played on a golden flute, and when she had finished, placed it on the bank. Then a rushing sound was heard, and a wave swept the flute off the bank. And soon the head of the hunter appeared and rose up higher and higher till he was half out of the water. Then he gazed sadly at his wife and stretched out his arms towards her. But another rushing wave arose and dragged him under once more. The hunter's wife, who had stood on the bank full of joy and hope, sank into despair when she saw her husband snatched away again before her eyes. But for her comfort, she dreamt the same dream a third time, and betook herself once more to the old witch's hut in the flowery meadow. This time the old woman told her to go the next full moon to the mill pond, and to spin there with a golden spinning wheel, and then to leave the spinning wheel on the bank. The hunter's wife did as she was advised, and the first night the moon was full. She sat and spun with a golden spinning wheel, and then left the wheel on the bank. In a few minutes a rushing sound was heard in the waters, and a wave swept the spinning wheel from the bank. Immediately the head of the hunter rose up from the pond, getting higher and higher each moment, till at length he stepped onto the bank and fell on his wife's neck. But the waters of the pond rose up suddenly, overflowed the bank where the couple stood, and dragged them under the flood. In her despair, the young wife called on the old witch to help her, and in a moment the hunter was turned into a frog and his wife into a toad. But they were not able to remain together, for the water tore them apart, and when the flood was over, they both resumed their own shapes again, but the hunter and the hunter's wife found themselves each in a strange country, and neither knew what had become of the other. The hunter determined to become a shepherd, and his wife too became a shepherdess. So they herded their sheep for many years in solitude and sadness. Now it happened once that the shepherd came to the country where the shepherdess lived. The neighborhood pleased him, and he saw that the pasture was rich and suitable for his flocks. So he brought his sheep there and herded them as before. The shepherd and shepherdess became great friends, but they did not recognize each other in the least. But one evening, when the moon was full, they sat together watching their flocks, and the shepherd played upon his flute. Then the shepherdess thought of that evening when she had sat at the full moon by the mill pond and had played on the golden flute. The recollection was too much for her, and she burst into tears. The shepherd asked her why she was crying, and left her no peace till she told him all her story. Then the scales fell from the shepherd's eyes, and he recognized his wife, and she him. So they returned joyfully to their own home, and lived in peace and happiness ever after. The Seven-Headed Serpent. Once upon a time there was a king who determined to take a long voyage. He assembled his fleet and all the seamen and set out. They went straight on night and day until they came to an island which was covered with large trees, and under every tree lay a lion. As soon as the king had landed his men, the lions all rose up together and tried to devour them. After a long battle, they managed to overcome the wild beasts, but the greater number of the men were killed. Those who remained alive now went on through the forest and found on the other side of it a beautiful garden, in which all the plants of the world flourished together. There were also in the garden 3 springs. The first flowed with silver, the second with gold, and the third with pearls. The men unbuckled their knapsacks and filled them with those precious things. In the middle of the garden they found a large lake, and when they reached the edge of it, the lake began to speak and said to them, "What men are you, and what brings you here? Are you come to visit our king?" But they were too much frightened to answer. Then the lake said, "You do well to be afraid, for it is at your peril that you are come hither. Our king, who has 7 heads, is now asleep, but in a few minutes he will wake up and come to me to take his bath. Woe to anyone who meets him in the garden, for it is impossible to escape from him. This is what you must do if you wish to save your lives. Take off your clothes and spread them on the path which leads from here to the castle. The king will then glide over something soft, which he likes very much, and he will be so pleased with that he will not devour you. He will give you some punishment, but then he will let you go." The men did as the lake advised them and waited for a time. At noon the earth began to quake and opened in many places, and out of the openings appeared lions, tigers, and other wild beasts, which surrounded the castle, and thousands of beasts came out of the castle, following their king, the 7-headed serpent. The serpent glided over the clothes which were spread for him, came to the lake, and asked it who had strewed those soft things on the path. The lake answered that it had been done by people who had come to do him homage. The king commanded that the men should be brought before him. They came humbly on their knees, and in a few words told him their story. Then he spoke to them with a mighty and terrible voice, and said, "Because you have dared to come here, I lay upon you the punishment. Every year you must bring me from among your people 12 youths and 12 maidens, that I may devour them. If you do not do this, I will destroy your whole nation." Then he desired one of his beasts to show the men the way out of the garden, and dismissed them. They then left the island and went back to their own country, where they related what had happened to them. Soon the time came round when the king of the beasts would expect the youths and maidens to be brought to him. The king therefore issued a proclamation inviting 12 youths and 12 maidens to offer themselves up to save their country, and immediately many young people, far more than enough, hastened to do so. A new ship was built and set with black sails, and in it the youths and maidens who were appointed for the king of the beasts embarked and set out for his country. When they arrived there, they went at once to the lake, and this time the lions did not stir, nor did the springs flow, and neither did the lake speak. So they waited then, and it was not long before the earth quaked even more terribly than the first time. The 7-headed serpent came without his train of beasts, saw his prey waiting for him, and devoured it at one mouthful. Then the ship's crew returned home, and the same thing happened yearly until many years had passed. Now the king of this unhappy country was growing old, and so was the queen, and they had no children. One day the queen was sitting at the window weeping bitterly because she was childless, and knew that the crown would therefore pass to strangers after the king's death. Suddenly a little old woman appeared before her, holding an apple in her hand, and said, "Why do you weep, my queen, and what makes you so unhappy?" "Alas, good mother," answered the queen, "I am unhappy because I have no children." "Is that what vexes you?" said the old woman. "Listen to me. I am a nun from the spinning convent, 10, and my mother, when she died, left me this apple. Whoever eats this apple shall have a child. The queen gave money to the old woman and bought the apple from her. Then she peeled it, ate it, and threw the rind out of the window. And it so happened that a mare that was running loose in the court below ate up the rind. After a time the queen had a little boy, and the mare also had a male foal. The boy and the foal grew up together and loved each other like brothers. In course of time the king died, and so did the queen, and their son, who was now 19 years old, was left alone. One day, when he and his horse were talking together, the horse said to him, "Listen to me, for I love you and wish for your good and that of the country. If you go on every year sending 12 youths and 12 maidens to the king of the beasts, your country will very soon be ruined. Mount upon my back. I will take you to a woman who can direct you how to kill the 7-headed serpent." Then the youth mounted his horse, who carried him far away to a mountain which was hollow, for in its side was a great underground cavern. In the cavern sat an old woman spinning. This was the cloister of the nuns, and the old woman was the abbess. They all spent their time in spinning, and that is why the convent has this name. All round the walls of the cavern there were beds cut out of the solid rock, upon which the nuns slept, and in the middle a light was burning. It was the duty of the nuns to watch the light in turns, that it might never go out, and if any one of them let it go out, the others put her to death. As soon as the king's son saw the old abbess spinning, he threw himself at her feet and entreated her to tell him how he could kill the 7-headed serpent. She made the youth rise, embraced him, and said, "Know, my son, that it is I who sent the nun to your mother and caused you to be born, and with you the horse, with whose help you will be able to free the world from the monster. I will tell you what you have to do. Load your horse with cotton, and go by a secret passage which I will show you, which is hidden from the wild beasts, to the serpent's palace. You will find the king asleep upon his bed, which is all hung round with bells, and over his bed you will see a sword hanging. With this sword only it is possible to kill the serpent, because even if its blade breaks, a new one will grow again for every head the monster has. Thus, you will be able to cut off all his 7 heads. And this you must also do in order to deceive the king. You must slip into his bedchamber very softly, and stop up all the bells which are round his bed with cotton. Then take down the sword gently, and quickly give the monster a blow on his tail with it. This will make him waken up, and if he catches sight of you, he will seize you. But you must quickly cut off his first head, and then wait till the next one comes up. Then strike it off also, and so go on till you have cut off all his 7 heads. The old abbess then gave the prince her blessing, and he set out upon his enterprise, arrived at the serpent's castle by following the secret passage which she had shown him, and by carefully attending to all her directions, he happily succeeded in killing the monster. As soon as the wild beasts heard of their king's death, they all hastened to the castle, but the youth had long since mounted his horse, and was already far out of their reach. They pursued him as fast as they could, but they found it impossible to overtake him, and he reached home in safety. Thus he freed his country from this terrible oppression. The 6 Swans. A king was once hunting in a great wood, and he hunted the game so eagerly that none of his courtiers could follow him. When evening came on, he stood still and looked round him, and he saw that he had quite lost himself. He sought a way out, but could find none. Then he saw an old woman with a shaking head coming towards him, but she was a witch. "Good woman," he said to her, "can you not show me the way out of the wood?" "Oh, certainly, Sir King," she replied. "I can quite well do that, but on one condition, which, if you do not fulfill, you will never get out of the wood and will die of hunger." "What is the condition?" asked the king. "I have a daughter," said the old woman, "who is so beautiful that she has not her equal in the world, and is well fitted to be your wife. If you will make her Lady Queen, I will show you the way out of the wood." The king in his anguish of mind consented, and the old woman led him to her little house where her daughter was sitting by the fire. She received the king as if she were expecting him, and he saw that she was certainly very beautiful, but she did not please him, and he could not look at her without a secret feeling of horror. As soon as he had lifted the maiden onto his horse, the old woman showed him the way, and the king reached his palace, where the wedding was celebrated. The king had already been married once, and had by his first wife 7 children, 6 boys and 1 girl, whom he loved more than anything in the world. And now, because he was afraid that their stepmother might not treat them well and might do them harm, he put them in a lonely castle that stood in the middle of a wood. It lay so hidden, and the way to it was so hard to find, that he himself could not have found it out, had not a wise woman given him a reel of thread which possessed a marvelous property. When he threw it before him, it unwound itself and showed him the way. But the king went so often to his dear children that the queen was offended at his absence. She grew curious and wanted to know what he had to do quite alone in the wood. She gave his servants a great deal of money, and they betrayed the secret to her, and also told her of the reel which alone could point out the way. She had no rest now till she had found out where the king guarded the reel. And then she made some little white shirts, and, as she had learned from her witch mother, sewed an enchantment in each of them. And when the king had ridden off, she took the little shirts and went into the wood, and the reel showed her the way. The children, who saw someone coming in the distance, thought it was their dear father coming to them, and sprang to meet him very joyfully. Then she threw over each one a little shirt, which, when it had touched their bodies, changed them into swans, and they flew away over the forest. The queen went home quite satisfied, and thought she had got rid of her stepchildren. But the girl had not run to meet her with her brothers, and she knew nothing of her. The next day the king came to visit his children, but he found no one but the girl. "Where are your brothers?" asked the king. "Alas, dear father," she answered, "they have gone away and left me all alone." And she told him that looking out of her little window, she had seen her brothers flying over the wood in the shape of swans. And she showed him the feathers which they had let fall in the yard and which she had collected. The king mourned, but he did not think that the queen had done the wicked deed, and as he was afraid the maiden would also be taken from him, he wanted to take her with him. But she was afraid of the stepmother, and begged the king to let her stay just 1 night more in the castle in the wood. The poor maiden thought, "My home is no longer here, I will go and seek my brothers." And when night came, she fled away into the forest. She ran all through the night and the next day till she could go no farther for weariness. Then she saw a little hut, went in, and found a room with 6 little beds. She was afraid to lie down on one, so she crept under one of them, lay on the hard floor, and was going to spend the night there. But when the sun had set, she heard a noise, and saw 6 swans flying in at the window. They stood on the floor, and blew at one another, and blew all their feathers off, and their swan skin came off like a shirt. Then the maiden recognized her brothers, and overjoyed, she crept out from under the bed. Her brothers were not less delighted than she to see their little sister again, but their joy did not last long. "You cannot stay here," they said to her. "This is a den of robbers. If they were to come here and find you, they would kill you." "Could you not protect me?" asked the little sister. "No," they answered. for we can only lay aside our swan skins for a quarter of an hour every evening. For this time we regain our human forms, but then we are changed into swans again." Then the little sister cried and said, "Can you not be freed?" "Oh, no," they said, "the conditions are too hard. You must not speak or laugh for 6 years, and must make in that time 6 shirts for us out of starflowers. If a single word comes out of your mouth, all your labor is vain." And when the brothers had said this, the quarter of an hour came to an end, and they flew away out of the window as swans. But the maiden had determined to free her brothers, even if it should cost her her life. She left the hut, went into the forest, climbed a tree, and spent the night there. The next morning she went out, collected starflowers, and began to sew. She could speak to no one, and she had no wish to laugh, so she sat there, looking only at her work. When she had lived there some time, it happened that the king of the country was hunting in the forest, and his hunters came to the tree on which the maiden sat. They called to her and said, "Who are you?" But she gave no answer. "Come down to us," they said. "We will do you no harm." But she shook her head silently. As they pressed her further with questions, she threw them the golden chain from her neck, but they did not leave off, and she threw them her girdle, and when this was no use, her garters, and then her dress. The huntsman would not leave her alone, but climbed the tree, lifted the maiden down, and led her to the king. The king asked, "Who are you? What are you doing up that tree?" But she answered nothing. He asked her in all the languages he knew, but she remained as dumb as a fish. Because she was so beautiful, however, the king's heart was touched, and he was seized with a great love for her. He wrapped her up in his cloak, placed her before him on his horse, and brought her to his castle. There he had her dressed in rich clothes, and her beauty shone out as bright as day, but not a word could be drawn from her. He set her at table by his side, and her modest ways and behavior pleased him so much that he said, "I will marry this maiden and none other in the world," and after some days he married her. But the king had a wicked mother who was displeased with the marriage, and said wicked things of the young queen. "Who knows who this girl is?" she said. "She cannot speak, and is not worthy of a king." After a year, when the queen had her first child, the old mother took it away from her. Then she went to the king and said that the queen had killed it. The king would not believe it, and would not allow any harm to be done her. But she sat quietly sewing at the shirts and troubling herself about nothing. The next time she had a child, the wicked mother did the same thing, but the king could not make up his mind to believe her. He said, "She is too sweet and good to do such a thing as that. If she were not dumb and could defend herself, her innocence would be proved." But when the third child was taken away, and the queen was again accused, and could not utter a word in her own defense, the king was obliged to give her over to the law, which decreed that she must be burnt to death. When the day came on which the sentence was to be executed, it was the last day of the 6 years, in which she must not speak or laugh. And now she had freed her dear brothers from the power of the enchantment. The 6 shirts were done. There was only the left sleeve wanting to the last. When she was led to the stake, she laid the shirts on her arm, and as she stood on the pile and the fire was about to be lighted, she looked around her and saw 6 swans flying through the air. Then she knew that her release was at hand, and her heart danced for joy. The swans fluttered round her and hovered low so that she could throw the shirts over them. When they had touched them, the swanskins fell off, and her brothers stood before her living, well and beautiful. Only the youngest had a swan's wing instead of his left arm. They embraced and kissed each other, and the queen went to the king, who was standing by in great astonishment, and began to speak to him, saying, "Dearest husband, now I can speak and tell you openly that I am innocent and have been falsely accused." She told him of the old woman's deceit, and how she had taken the 3 children away and hidden them. Then they were fetched, to the great joy of the king, and the wicked mother came to no good end. But the king and the queen with their 6 brothers lived many years in happiness and peace.